While most people imagine the women of World War II primarily as nurses, mothers, volunteers, or victims, there exists a shadow layer of history that exposes a completely different reality. Women who became active participants in the Nazi killing machine. They didn't just stand by, they took a direct part in the functioning of the death camps, reinforcing a system of terror that operated at full force. These women were not merciful angels, as they are sometimes romantically imagined, but full-fledged links in the mechanism of the Holocaust, playing a role in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. The idea of involving women in the SS system did not arise spontaneously. It matured under the conditions of the total militarization of the Nazi state, where even the most distant social structures had to be subordinated to ideology. Specifically, between 1942 and 1944, when the number of prisoners in the camps reached millions and male guards were massively sent to the front, the Third Reich faced a personnel shortage. It was then that they began to more actively recruit women for service in the concentration camps. This process had two components: deception and ideological manipulation. The work for women in the camps was presented as promising and humane. In Nazi brochures and advertisements, it looked appealing: a free uniform, regular food, housing, a high salary for the time, and stability. An ideal place for a young woman, especially against the backdrop of the general instability of the war. For many, it truly looked like a chance to break free from poverty and find a place for themselves in a great state cause. In some cases, women went to serve without a full understanding of the real nature of their future work, but this naivety did not last long. Very quickly, the illusions were shattered. A cold, lethal mechanism stood before them, and each one had to decide: accept the rules of the game or step away. However, a significant number of the women who became part of this system knew perfectly well what they were getting into. They were not people who stumbled into evil by chance. Many of them were raised in the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls, youth organizations that actively instilled ideas of racial superiority, devotion to the Führer, and unquestioning subordination. For them, ideology was not something abstract, but a daily norm. They sincerely believed in their mission: the purification of Europe from Jews, Roma, prisoners, and the unworthy. They didn't need to be lied to. They themselves were eager to join this great project. The training for these women took place in specialized locations, such as Ravensbrück or Lichtenberg. These were not just recruitment centers, but effectively schools of evil. There, women were taught discipline, obedience to the system, physical assault, crowd control, and psychological pressure. They were instilled with the belief that a prisoner was not a human being, but an enemy of the state, an animal that could be beaten, humiliated, and destroyed without remorse. The SS ethics lessons essentially turned into courses in dehumanization, and while not all of them immediately turned into sadists, each one knew what system they had found themselves in. Young women predominated among the female guards. They were 20-25 years old, sometimes even younger. It was this youth that was the most dangerous. It combined ideological immaturity with physical activity, allowing the system to form loyal personnel who didn't ask questions. Many of them sought not only stability but also an opportunity to fulfill themselves in a state where women had few career opportunities. The role of Aufseherin, female guard, gave them real power: the right to punish, humiliate, and decide who would live and who would die. During their service in the camps, these women performed far more than just formal duties. Their actions were direct and often brutal. They didn't just maintain order, they participated in selections, where prisoners were separated, some for labor, others for the gas chambers. They beat, tormented, and humiliated people, often without any visible reason. Witnesses said that some of the guards derived genuine pleasure from it. The power they had never had before was now intoxicating. The ability to use force with impunity against those who could not fight back became for many a source of a new, pathological self-identity. The most notorious among them were those whose cruelty went beyond even the camp norms. Irma Grace, one of the most infamous guards of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, was only 21 years old at the time. She not only personally beat prisoners but also had a public image as the beautiful death. Always neat, smiling, with a whip in her hand, everyone feared her. Elisabeth Volkenrath, one of the most active in the system, worked in several camps. Her prisoners remembered her as a person who gladly beat prisoners and participated in selections for death. Hermine Braunsteiner and Maria Mandel also distinguished themselves with particular cruelty. The first, according to testimonies, beat even children, while the second organized cultural events for officers near the gas chambers. But it is important to understand, Irma Grisi was not the only one. There were dozens like her, less famous, but no less cruel. Some were completely unmasked in the atmosphere of the camp, others adapted to the environment, submitting to its laws. Not one of them could say that they didn't know. Even those who came to the camp without a full understanding saw clearly what they were taking part in after just a few days, and they stayed. Thus arose a paradoxical and terrible reality. Femininity, which is usually associated with care, tenderness, and moral empathy, was here distorted beyond recognition. In the Nazi system, even a female role could become an instrument of mass destruction, cold, clearly organized, and merciless. When the Reich began to falter, cracks appeared not only in the concrete of bunkers and headquarters, but also in the psychological makeup of those who had served the system until the very end. The female guards in the death camps, so proud in their uniforms just a short time before, suddenly lost their footing. The system that had protected them, fed them, and provided them with power began to crumble. And along with its fall, a wave of panic swept over almost every one of them. For many, everything happened unexpectedly fast. Just yesterday, they were leading columns of prisoners and punishing with a sense of impunity those who were not quick enough to line up. And today, they were burning documents, tearing off their insignias, and hastily burying photos of themselves in uniform. Some sought refuge in the mountains, while others tried to blend into the crowds in the ruins of cities where the chaos of surrender offered a chance to disappear. Many had an escape plan. Some hid in rural areas where less was known about the death camps, while others headed for zones controlled by the Americans or British, hoping for more lenient treatment. The external changes were only part of the disguise. They pretended to be peasant women, nurses, cooks. Sometimes they even invented new names. The documents showed surnames that had no connection to the real person, but this rarely helped. The death camps left a deep imprint on the memory of those who survived. Former prisoners were the first to recognize the guards on the streets, in hospitals, and in lines for rations. It was not so much the uniform, but the look, the voice, the gait that gave them away. And as soon as one recognized figure appeared before a witness, an avalanche of investigations was triggered. There were dozens of cases of recognition. One happened when an Auschwitz prisoner recognized Irma Grese among the staff of a field hospital. Another was recognized in Berlin when she was ordering workers at the train station to line up. Her tone was too familiar, and that was enough to launch an inquiry. Former prisoners meticulously described their behavior, habits, and even their intonations. These descriptions were often more accurate than any photograph. From then on, a wave of arrests began. Women were arrested by the Allies, the British, Americans, and Soviet soldiers. Their subsequent fate depended on which zone of control fell into which army's hands. The reaction of those detained varied. Some broke down in tears and claimed they were just following orders. Others denied everything, stating they were just ordinary workers. But there were also those who did not hide their role. They admitted to participating in torture and the selection of prisoners, sometimes without any emotion, as if they were talking about administrative work. And this perhaps was the most frightening thing, this internal emptiness, the absence of remorse. After the arrests, investigations began that lasted for months. All prisoner testimonies were carefully checked, and face-to-face confrontations were held. Investigators often encountered the phenomenon of moral blindness. The accused did not consider themselves guilty. They spoke of discipline, hierarchy, and orders. But in reality, as the investigations showed, the cruelty was often voluntary, caused not by pressure from above, but by an internal desire to dominate. The culmination was the high-profile trials. The most prominent of these was the Hamburg trial in 1947, where the Ravensbrück staff was tried. There, women sat in the dock who were responsible not only for supervision, but also for participation in medical experiments, the selection of prisoners for death, and brutal treatment. The trial showed that the role of women in the mechanism of destruction was by no means secondary. The Auschwitz trial of the same year continued this theme, highlighting the horrific efficiency of the female guards in the most lethal camp. The names of Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Maria Mandel appeared in the headlines of world newspapers. They became symbols of female participation in the Holocaust. It was then that the world saw that cruelty has no gender, and that ideology can turn even a young girl into a participant in genocide. The court also examined aspects of normality outside of their work, how these women laughed, listened to music, and corresponded with relatives without feeling any internal conflict with their daily work, the death of others. The Stutthof trial of 1946 was another blow to the notion that only the main executioners were responsible. Here, women were tried who were not widely known, but showed a gruesome initiative in their torment. Their actions were so inhumane that they shocked even the investigators, beating children, tormenting pregnant women, and torturing for fun. They did not just work within the system. They were its most brutal embodiment. And although many dark spots remained, women who escaped, changed their names, and avoided trial, it was these tribunals that became the point of no return. For the first time, the world clearly established that women not only supported the system of genocide, but were also a driving force behind it. Their gender was not an excuse, and none of them could hide behind the words, "I was just following orders." What had previously seemed like an exception, the participation of women in Camp Terror, turned out to be a systemic phenomenon. Many of them not only performed their duties, but also actively participated in beatings, punitive measures, initiated reprisals, and led forced marches. Some became models of sadism, others, silent executors. But the court documents and testimony records said one thing: the level of cruelty was often on par with that of the men. And when these women appeared before the court, it no longer mattered whether they had been nurses or secretaries in the past. They were part of a single death machine. When the final words were spoken in the halls of the war tribunals and witnesses with broken voices left the stand, the time for verdicts arrived. And for many women who, until recently, had absolute power in their camps, this was a moment of the deepest fall. The iron confidence that had sustained them in the death camps began to dissolve. Only now, in the face of inevitable accountability, did some of them finally confront what it means to be defenseless. The sentences varied, depending on the degree of guilt, the number of documented testimonies, and the specific role in the camp. But the most high-profile trials ended with death sentences. The public, which followed these judicial events, was struck not only by the cruelty of the crimes, but also by how young these women were. Some of them were born in the early 1920s and were not even 25 years old at the time of the trial. This created a harsh moral dissonance. How could a girl barely in her 20s torment, torture, and kill with such indifference? But reality offered no room for romanticism. These young faces turned out to be masks for one of the most brutal manifestations of human degradation. Death sentences were carried out publicly, in the presence of Allied representatives, and often with photographic documentation. It is thanks to this that history has preserved images from moments that became symbols of justice. Irma Grese, one of the most infamous guards, the blonde with the leather whip, received a death sentence for numerous crimes in Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Her behavior during the trial was defiant. She showed almost no remorse, holding herself proudly as if she still had power over someone. But on the day of her execution, that self-control vanished. According to witnesses before the gallows, she turned pale, her legs trembled, and she uttered only a few words. "Schnell! Faster!" an order she herself had once given to the condemned. Others were executed with her. However, not everyone received a death sentence. Some were given long prison terms, 10, 15, 25 years. The reasons were varied: Fewer witnesses, a lack of direct evidence, or specific legal circumstances. But even behind bars, some of them showed no remorse. In the memoirs of other prisoners in post-war jails, it was mentioned that the former SS guards remained proud, unrepentant, and even defended their actions, believing that they had acted for the good of the Reich. This only reinforces the understanding of how deeply rooted the ideology was that gave these women moral justification even after the total collapse of the Third Reich. But the history of the SS women does not end in courtrooms or under the gallows. Among them were also those who came out of the war unscathed, at least legally. Some managed to flee to other countries, taking advantage of the fact that the world had not yet recovered from the war. The most popular destination for escape was Latin America, especially Argentina and Brazil. There, established communities of German immigrants already existed, and Nazi criminals often found refuge in such circles. Others remained in Europe, posing as civilian refugees or starting a new life under assumed names in West or East Germany. Many of them worked as nurses, teachers, or clerks, never mentioning their past. They managed to avoid Allied attention due to the lack of systematic lists of suspects. While some received a bullet or a noose for their torture, others quietly drank coffee in post-war cafes, unnoticed, forgotten, but guilty. What is particularly striking is that some of these women lived for decades without being exposed. One example is a guard who settled in a small Austrian town after the war, where she lived until the 1990s, working in a school. She was recognized by chance, by a former prisoner who saw her photo in a local newspaper. Such stories prove that historical justice is not a guaranteed process, but a constant struggle of memory against forgetting. Against this backdrop, the act of documenting the truth became increasingly important, not just the legal verdicts. Archives, memoirs, photographs, testimonies, all of this was transformed into tools of historical judgment. Even those who were not condemned by a tribunal received condemnation in the memories of victims, in academic research, and in the textbooks that students study. And although justice was not always complete, memory proved to be more enduring. Today, the image of the female SS guard is more than just a fragment of history. It is proof that evil has no gender, age, or appearance. It is a reminder that everyday cruelty is no less dangerous than systemic violence, and the most terrifying thing is that it can live nearby, disguised as normalcy. After World War II, humanity had to learn, evil often does not come in the form of a monster. Sometimes it smiles, puts on a white blouse, and says, "I was just following orders."